It gives me great pleasure to have the opportunity to welcome to the Cathedral Church Ambassador, His Excellency David Comissiong, to be our speaker on this occasion. Ambassador Comissiong is no stranger to the Barbadian community, and I'm certain he's no stranger to the regional community, and I would suspect that he's very well known in Pan-African circles and wide world. Welcome to you, sir, again. Ambassador Comissiong has been a leading person in the Pan-Africanist movement in the Caribbean and has been a pioneer in the Barbadian context, where he was the chair of the Pan-African Commission, which was set up in 1998 in Barbados, and which has pioneered some good work, which I think we are still receiving the benefits. In fact, the fact that the church is now observing African awareness, I think, could be attributed to that work that was done in the 90s and which has continued under the leadership, for the most part, of Ambassador Comissiong. He's an author. He's authored a book. It's The Healing of the Nations, the Case for Reparations in an Era of Recession and Recolonization. He's also authored Marching Down to Wide Streets of Tomorrow, Emancipation Essays and Speeches. He's an attorney by profession. He's married, and they have 2 daughters, he and his wife. Ambassador, we look forward very much to your message this morning. I'm certain you have prepared well for it. And in conceptualizing this series, your name was one that came up immediately. I was pleased when you immediately accepted our invitation. And so it is now my pleasure to invite you to address us.
Good morning, church. And I would like to begin by thanking the Dean, the very Reverend Jeffrey Gibson, for extending this invitation to participate in this African Heritage Month service. I want to say how impressed I am by the Anglican Church having embraced African Heritage Month and using the church and your pulpits to spread good information and education about our Pan-African selves. Two Sundays ago, I had the privilege of addressing the congregation at Christ the King. So it seems that the Anglican Church is leading the way in this embrace of African Heritage Month. Now, my topic this morning is reparations for African enslavement must produce the just society. And I want to begin with the abolition of slavery in Barbados and across the British Empire, way back in 1834. After some 225 years of relentless rebellion by our enslaved ancestors, slavery was abolished throughout the British Empire. And the methodology devised by the British government for the abolition of slavery was to calculate the capital or labor value of the then existing generation of enslaved Africans in places like Barbados and across the Caribbean, who were supposedly owned by these British slave masters, and to compensate not our enslaved ancestors, but to compensate the slave masters for their supposed loss of property. And the value of that generation of enslaved Africans was calculated by the British government at £47 million. And this is how they paid out those £47 million to the slave masters. They paid them £20 million in cash. And the other £27 million, they said, well, we will pay them the other £27 million in free labor. And so our supposedly free ancestors were then required to give free labor for an additional 6 years as so-called apprentices. So that is how they paid out that £47 million. Now, what is important for us today is to note that that £47 million back in 1834, in today's values, would be 178 billion pounds. So when we are talking about reparations, let's start with that figure. Let's start with the figure calculated by the British government. 178 billion pounds was deemed to be the value of that one generation of our enslaved ancestors. The £20 million that they paid in cash back then was so large, it actually constituted 40% of the annual budget of Britain. And in order to pay those £20 million, the British government back then had to borrow money and had to issue government bonds for those borrowings. And do you know that the final payment on those slavery compensation bonds, the final payment was made in the year 2015, a mere 7 years ago. So when you hear some folk telling you that reparations is about some ancient history all in the past, not true. The British government was paying the debt, the compensation that they decided to give to the slave plantation owners as recently as 2015. Also take note that that calculation of 178 billion pounds in today's values were for one generation of enslaved Africans. But there was not just one generation in places like Barbados. There were multiple generations of enslaved Africans who were worked to death in these plantations. Furthermore, that 178 billion pound valuation had nothing to do. This was just for the labor value of that generation. It had nothing to do with the 225 years of whippings, mutilations, castrations, burning to death, beheadings, starvings, rapes, branding with hot irons, hangings, and breaking at the wheel, or with the horrors of the Middle Passage. You know, we need to be aware of what our ancestors went through. Truth be told, the world's first concentration camps are not to be found in Nazi Germany of the 1930s and 40s. The world's first concentration camps were those slave plantations in places like Barbados and Jamaica way back in the 1640s. That kind of terroristic oppression of human beings was virtually pioneered in places like Barbados. We also need to note that that 178 billion pounds had nothing to do with the destruction wrought on the continent of Africa itself. The destruction of towns, villages, and kingdoms. The mass kidnappings, the displacement of millions of people, the plague of European diseases, the decimation of people and livestock, the depopulation of Africa, the disruption of Africa's historical developmental process and trajectory. So when you're talking about compensation, you understand where the figure is going. Nor did that 178 billion pounds have anything to do with the unjust enrichment from which Britain and Europe profited. The development of Europe's massively wealthy industrial civilization at the expense of the plundering and underdevelopment of Africa and of the sons and daughters of Africa in the Caribbean and the Americas. The development of European shipping, shipbuilding, manufacturing industry, agro-processing industry, the infrastructural development in the form of harbors, docks, canals, heavy engineering works and major cities, the development of banking and insurance, and of a multiplicity of family and company fortunes that financed and endowed a multiplicity of institutions, inclusive of universities. That massive and wealthy European civilization was developed on the basis of the plundering, the siphoning off of the resources from places like Barbados. And let me bring it home to Barbados. There's a plantation in Barbados called the Draxhall Plantation. It's there in St. George. It was founded by a man called James Drax, Sir James Drax. He came to Barbados in 1627 on the first ship that brought the British settlers. And James Drax became the pioneer of what was called the Sugar Revolution. It was he who pioneered this idea of developing this sugar plantation that would generate super abundant profits on the basis of the super exploitation of African labor. That plantation has been continuously in operation since the 1640s up to now, owned by the same Drax family. Do you know? So for almost 400 years, the fruits of the labor of our ancestors was siphoned off. It didn't come to our ancestors. It was siphoned off to Europe, to Britain, to the Drax family and other families. Today, the leading representative of that Drax family, Sir Richard Drax, is the richest member of the British House of Commons. So that is what we mean when we talk about the unjust enrichment. For generations, our ancestors did not get to keep the fruits of their labor. The fruits of their labor was siphoned off to European families, to European institutions, and ultimately to European nations. It is against this background, therefore, that in July of 2013, the 15 heads of government of our Caribbean community, Caricom, made an historic decision to launch a reparations claim against the governments of Europe that participated in enslavement in the Caribbean. Actually, the claim is for, and I'm glad that in the text, in the readings this morning, you mentioned the indigenous people. Our reparations claim is actually, first of all, for the genocide perpetrated against the 15 million indigenous people that the Europeans found in these islands and decimated. There were indigenous people in Barbados, but they were decimated, even before the British came, they were decimated by the Spanish, who raided Barbados, enslaved them, and took them away to work as slaves in other Spanish plantations. So we claim for the genocide perpetrated against the indigenous people, and we also claim for the multiplicity of crimes against humanity that were committed against our enslaved Black or African ancestors. And having made the decision to pursue the claim, Caricom then set up an institutional structure to pursue it. And that institutional structure consists of national reparations committees or task forces. So in every Caricom country, the government has set up a national committee or task force on reparations. Our task force is presently headed by Mr. Trevor Prescott, a Member of Parliament, and the Prime Minister's Special Envoy. And the chairman or chairperson of each national task force is then brought together in a regional Caricom Reparations Commission, and that institution is chaired by Sir Hilary Beckles. We have also set up a Caricom Reparations Research Center at the University of the West Indies in Jamaica. So that research center helps to do research that can be passed on to the Reparations Commission. And then at the apex of the entire structure, we set up a Caricom Prime Ministerial Subcommittee on Reparations that consists of 6 prime ministers or presidents, chaired by Barbados. So the Prime Minister of Barbados is the permanent chairperson of that Prime Ministerial Subcommittee, and it is that Prime Ministerial Subcommittee that gives policy guidance to the Caricom Reparations Commission, and that filters down to the national committees. Having set up that structure in 2013, by early 2014, the Caricom Reparations Commission had designed the Caricom Reparatory Justice Program, centered around a so-called 10-point demand that was levied at the European governments. And I'll tell you what those 10 demands are. Number 1, a formal apology from the European governments for those crimes against humanity. Secondly, that they should finance a voluntary repatriation program for those persons of our societies who are interested in physically returning to the continent of Africa. We know our Rastafari brothers, for example, wish to physically repatriate. We are saying the European governments must finance that process. An Indigenous Peoples Development Program for the remaining members of the indigenous community that still are to be found in our Caribbean islands, most of them living in great poverty. A program to establish relevant and needed cultural institutions in the Caribbean. A program to deal with the Caribbean's public health crisis. We suffer, of all the people in the world, we suffer more from diabetes and hypertension and those diet and stress-related diseases than any other people on the face of the planet. And that's because of those centuries of living in an environment of terror and of a very poor and deficient diet. An education development program for the Caribbean, an African knowledge program for people of the Caribbean component of the African diaspora. In other words, that we can reconnect with knowledge of our ancestral continent. A technology transfer program, a process of debt cancellation of the national debts of Caricom member states, and finally, a systematic effort at psychological rehabilitation and healing from the traumas of the centuries of genocide and enslavement. But of course, that aspect of it, we basically will have to do ourselves. By April 2014, Caricom had been so impressive that we actually helped the United States of America to set up their own national African American Reparations Committee. And since then, that committee has gone on to do great work. In the last presidential election, you would have heard US presidential candidates committing themselves to reparations. That's a testimony to the work done by the Caricom Reparations Commission. In 2016, we wrote to the European governments, Britain, Spain, France, the Netherlands, Denmark, Portugal, laying out our reparations claim to them, telling them that we had launched this claim against them, telling them about the 10-point demand plan, and inviting them to meet with us to discuss how best both sides could amicably resolve this issue. And we said to them, look, we prefer to deal with this by sitting down around a negotiating table and working it out. Needless to say, we received responses, but they were all non-committal responses. So we know that we have work to do. We know it is going to be a struggle. They're not just going to concede. By 2019, the European Union Parliament had passed a resolution acknowledging the legitimacy of the demand for reparations and encouraging European Union nations to make reparations. However, in their opinion, that reparation should consist of apologies for slavery and the return of stolen historical and cultural artifacts. So we still have to get them now to take the other step to understand that real compensation is required. And in 2019, the University of Glasgow made, in a sense, the first reparations settlement when they acknowledged that their university had benefited from the ill-gotten gains of enslavement, and they entered into a reparations compact with our University of the West Indies, valued at £20 million. So that was very encouraging because it said that our reparations claim was beginning to bear fruit. And then the final development I want to tell you about was in just February of 2021, just February last year, when the Caricom, the Prime Ministerial Subcommittee on Reparations, kind of refocused the Caricom reparations campaign. And the first thing we said that we were going to do in refocusing it, that we need to reach out to Africa and to the African Union and to invite Africa to come on board the campaign with us, to be our partners in the campaign. And this is extremely appropriate because Africa suffered just as much as we suffered here in the Caribbean. We also said that in light of the fact, even though we are targeting the governments of Europe, but in light of the fact that several private sector institutions had begun to admit their complicity and had begun to admit that they needed to make some form of recompense, that we needed to target those private sector institutions as well as the governments. And we decided to do the technical work to set up an international development fund that would be directed at payments from those private institutions. And I'll give you a list of some of the institutions that have admitted complicity and have said that they know they need to make some form of compensation. Well, we heard about the University of Glasgow, but also Lloyd's of London, the big banking and insurance institution, the Bank of England, the Green King Company, Princeton Theological Seminary, Georgetown University, and the Church of England, in a sense, your former parent church. And the list goes on. And the final new area of focus that the Caricom Prime Minister said we must pursue is that we must now emphasize international diplomatic engagement at the highest levels of the United Nations, that we must mesh our claim for reparations with the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And basically, the idea that is being developed is that this currently existing international economic and political order that we live in has its roots in and evolved out of those centuries of criminal enslavement and oppression and exploitation of our people. And if we examine this currently existing order, we can see that the nations, the black nations of the Caribbean and Africa, have been inserted into this order in a structurally subservient and still exploitative manner. So, for example, you have a UN Security Council. There's no black nation as a permanent member of that UN Security Council. You have the IMF and the World Bank, and the decision-making power in those institutions do not feature African or Caribbean countries. The international terms of trade, they disadvantage us. So the idea is taking root that another component of our reparations claim must be a reparative restructuring of the international economic and political order to make it more fair and just. And so I would say that we now have a four-pronged reparations program in the Caribbean. The first prong consists of our claim levied at the national governments of Europe. And our claim levied at the national governments of Europe is not for individual money payments. It is for a developmental compact, that 10-point demand that we have put together. Secondly, our claim directed at the private sector institutions, the banks, the insurance companies, the families like the Drax family, the universities like Oxford that were endowed by money derived from enslavement. Thirdly, that effort to carry out a reparative restructuring of the international economic and political order. And fourthly, and very importantly, the self-repairs that we must do on ourselves, because part of the reparations is about repairing the damage, and we know that every people who go through trauma, any kind of trauma, you are marked by that trauma. And we have gone through centuries of trauma. And so we must be conscious that wherever we need to look at ourselves, and wherever we find within our psyche any vestiges of notions of white superiority and black inferiority, we have to work on that, and we have to remove any such vestiges. So we have some psychological and cultural repairs to do on ourselves as well. And so our Caricom Reparations Justice Initiative has been repositioned and sharpened and refocused, and our heads of government have given us our marching orders. The task now ahead of us is to consolidate a worldwide reparations campaign. And this is why the partnership with Africa is so important. We must now go on to develop an international campaign as powerful and as wide in its scope as the anti-apartheid movement of the 1970s and 1980s. You remember that movement where the world tackled the problem of apartheid in South Africa. We need a reparations campaign of that magnitude and power, and that's what we must set out to do. And I will conclude now by saying that I want to go right back now to the title of this talk. Reparations for African enslavement must produce the just society. it is clear to me that the fundamental principle of our reparations movement is that the campaign for reparations or reparative justice must be designed to produce the just society. And what I mean is that the demand for reparations must be formulated as a demand for a fundamental transformation of the currently existing inequitable and exploitative economic and power relations that exist both in the international arena and in our domestic societies. And implicit in the demand of our Caribbean and African governments for reparations must be a commitment. Implicit in the demand, if our governments are demanding reparations for injustice done to Black or African people, they themselves must be committed to deliver justice to their own people. You cannot be you cannot be pointing a finger at others and claiming justice for injustices done, and you yourself perpetrate injustice. And so this is a commitment that the masses of our Caribbean and African people must hold our governments to through our own dynamism and activism and advocacy as people. Finally, let me assert that the overarching objective of the reparations campaign must be to ensure that no African descendant is left behind in a slavery-like condition of poverty and powerlessness. Our enslaved African ancestors were all brought to the so-called New World, to places like Barbados, against their will, as an undifferentiated human collective in the bottom of a slave ship. And they were all deposited at the very bottom of a structure of exploitation and dispossession. They all therefore shared a common predicament and engaged in a common struggle to survive and to extricate themselves from the imposed condition. And over the years, some of us have been more fortunate than others and have managed to remove ourselves from the bottom slavery-like conditions of the social order. But there are still many of us who continue to exist in slavery-like conditions of poverty. And so our resolve must be to not leave any Black sister or brother behind in such a condition. The fundamental mission of the reparations campaign must therefore be to provide resources, mechanisms, and programs that reach out to every sister and brother who still finds herself or himself in a slavery-like condition of poverty, and to lift him or her out of that mire. Like every good kinship group or army platoon, we must be resolved not to leave any of our fraternity behind. Reparations must be infused with the principle of justice, and we must use it to ensure that none of God's children is left behind. Thank you very much.